You're listening to the free ad-sponsored re-release of American Elections Wicked Game, a weekly march through every presidential election from 1789 to 2024. To listen to all episodes right now ad-free, go to intohistory.com. Subscribers there enjoy ad-free listening, early access, bonus content, and more from a growing collection of great history podcasts. Start your free trial today at intohistory.com. It's December 12th, 1941, at a military base in Texas. Days ago, the Japanese launched a surprise attack against Pearl Harbor. In response, President Roosevelt declared war on Japan. The soldiers at Fort Sam Houston are on high alert. One of their officers, Brigadier General Dwight D. Eisenhower, is anxious to receive his orders and hopefully get into the fight. Hello?
Hello? Is that you, Ike?
Yes, what can I do for you, Colonel?
Chief has a message for you.
The Chief, or General George Marshall, is the Army Chief of Staff for the War Department. And the man on the other end of the line is his right-hand man, Colonel Walter Smith. Ike hopes that this is the phone call he's been waiting for. And what's the message?
Chief says for you to hop on a plane. Get up here right away.
Ike sighs. These are not the orders he was hoping to receive. During World War I, Ike had frantically tried to see some action. He all but begged his superiors, but the higher-ups at the War Department shot him down. In this new conflict, Ike desperately wants to be in command of troops on the front lines, not sitting behind a desk in Washington. But orders are orders.
Tell your superiors formal paperwork is on the way. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, Colonel. I will. Ike is heartbroken, but he is a soldier, and a soldier does as he's told. Despairing, he picks up the phone and dials his wife to give her the bad news.
Hello?
Pack a bag, Mamie.
Why?
We're headed for Washington. In December of 1941, Ike was extremely disappointed to be called back to Washington. In his nearly 30 years of military service, Ike had never seen combat, and the orders from General Marshall gave him little hope he ever would. But Ike wouldn't be disappointed for long. In the summer of 1942, out of a field of nearly 400 candidates, General George Marshall chose Ike to lead the U.S. forces. In June of 1942, Eisenhower arrived at U.S. headquarters in London and took command. He then received multiple promotions. In December of 1943, Ike was appointed Supreme Allied Commander of Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of northwestern Europe. Operation Overlord was the largest sea, air, and land invasion in U.S. history, and under Ike's leadership, the mission was a success. By the time Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945, Eisenhower was a 5-star general. His leadership in World War II earned him the trust of the American people, and it earned him their votes in the presidential election of 1952. During his first term, President Eisenhower would again be confronted with international turmoil. This time, as he geared up for the 1956 campaign, General Ike would do his best to avoid war and would make damn sure he was the only one giving orders.
Romans, I will give you the greatest games on earth!
Show them you can fight or die trying.
From the producers of 300.
A 4-horse race is a suicide.
Let the games begin!
Starring Oscar winner Anthony Hopkins.
Behold, this arena will be built for Rome.
Rise or die.
Those About to Die. A new Peacock original series streaming July 18th.
Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also ad-free, like Her Half of History. Because even though Hillary Clinton may not have made history when she ran for president in 2016, there have always been women who seized power, spied for their country, created artistic masterpieces, even escaped slavery. Her Half of History is perfect for all those who sat in history class and wondered, what were the women doing all this time? Because the answer is a lot. Get Her Half of History, Wicked Game, and many others ad-free at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. From Airship, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is American Elections Wicked Game. By the end of World War II, Ike was a hero and a household name. His fame as a general and the supreme commander of the North American Treaty Organization, or NATO, catapulted him all the way to the White House in 1952. Ike brought his military training with him. He would need it. President Eisenhower inherited the Cold War, a power struggle between the U.S. and the Communist Soviet Union. The U.S. and the USSR were locked in a furious arms race as they competed for global dominance. This led to an ever-present threat of war breaking out all over the world. As Ike struggled to keep the U.S. out of military conflicts, he ran the White House like the general he was, and he expected his subordinates to fall in line. But many members of his own party struggled with that concept. As Ike strove for moderation in his foreign policy, his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, became the strongest voice urging Ike to take a firm, militaristic stance against the Soviet Union and their agenda to expand communism. Meanwhile, many Democrats believed the Cold War was spinning out of control. Democrats attacked Ike's foreign policy for going too far, calling for an end to the Cold War, a ban on nuclear weapons testing, and a decrease in military spending. The 1956 presidential election would be a domestic contest centered around foreign affairs, because as the campaign got underway, the Cold War heated up. A crisis in Egypt over the Suez Canal threatened to undo the peace Ike had fought so hard to maintain. Ike was simultaneously struggling to prevent the Cold War from turning hot and facing off against two political opponents. As Democratic candidate Adlai Stevenson fought to beat him in the general election, Ike's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, fought to undermine his foreign policy, bringing the nation to the brink of war. This is episode 43, 1956, Eisenhower versus Stevenson, A Chance for Peace. It's April 16th, 1953. President Eisenhower sits in the ballroom of the Statler Hotel in Washington, D.C., preparing to address the American Society for Newspaper Editors in his first major speech since taking office. His message will be broadcast nationwide. In his remarks, the president will say he wants to ease the growing tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. His Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, disagrees, though. He suggested Eisenhower threaten the Soviets into submission, but Ike ignored him. And now he's ready to present his agenda to the nation.
In this spring of 1953, the free world weighs one question above all others: the chances for a just peace for all people.
Ike outlines 5 principles the U.S. should follow in order to achieve that peace. He draws a contrast between the posture of the U.S. and that of the Soviet Union.
In the light of these principles, the citizens of the United States define the way they propose to follow through the aftermath of war toward true peace. The Soviet government held a vastly different vision. In the world of its design, security was to be found not in mutual trust and mutual aid, but in force. Huge armies, subversion, rule of neighbor nations. The goal was power superiority at all costs. Security was to be sought by denying it to all others.
Against the wishes of his Secretary of State, Ike then extends an offer of friendship and peace to the Soviets. He argues the current arms race robs American and Soviet citizens of precious resources.
Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. This is not a way of life at all, in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. This is one of those times in the affairs of nations when the gravest choices must be made if there is to be a turning toward a just and lasting peace. It is a moment that calls upon the governments of the world to speak their intentions with simplicity and with honesty.
Ike does not talk in abstracts. He gets into specifics and addresses the recently concluded military conflict in Korea, as well as tensions between East and West Germany. Ike also discusses the recent death of USSR Premier Joseph Stalin, sends a strong message to the new Soviet leadership.
We welcome every honest act of peace. We care nothing for mere rhetoric. We care only for sincerity of peaceful purpose, attested by deed.
Journalists and listeners all across the country applauded Ike's clear message of friendship and peace. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles did not. Dulles worried that Ike's speech would sound weak and encouraged the Soviet Union's agenda to expand communism. Ike's A Chance for Peace speech marked the first time the president and his Secretary of State clashed over foreign policy, but it would not be the last. The conflict between Ike and Dulles would play out in several arenas, but nowhere more conspicuously than Egypt. Dulles took a hard line against the Soviets, arguing, "In the world chess game, the Reds today have the better position. Practically everywhere one looks, there is danger of communist penetration." But Ike took a more moderate view. He wanted to cultivate a friendship with the USSR, reminding Dulles, "We cannot live alone. We need allies." Throughout his first term, Ike often ignored Dulles's ideas whenever they clashed with his own. But in September of 1955, Ike's declining health would give Dulles an opportunity to push his agenda. In the early hours of September 24th, Ike had a heart attack while on vacation in Colorado. During his 2-month recovery, Ike still kept a firm hand on the workings of the White House from his hospital bed in Denver. Vice President Nixon ran cabinet meetings at Ike's direction, while staffers traveled to Colorado to get Ike's stamp of approval on key projects. But while Ike recovered in Denver, Dulles stayed in Washington, D.C., away from Ike's prying eyes. And during this time, the issue of Egypt reared its head. Egypt was one of the many arenas of the Cold War. Both the U.S. and the USSR were seeking to exert influence over Arab nations like Egypt, and Ike was hopeful for positive relations between the U.S. and Egypt. Dulles, though, was deeply skeptical, in no small part because Egyptian President Gamal Nasser took a neutralist stance on communism. Nasser cultivated relationships with many countries without consideration for their societal leanings. This frustrated Dulles, who saw neutralism as an act of heresy, tantamount to an endorsement of communism. 3 days after Ike's heart attack, President Nasser finalized an arms deal with the Soviet Union. This move only fueled Dulles' suspicion that Egypt was not to be trusted. While Ike recovered in the hospital, Dulles searched for a way to get Egypt under America's control, and the Aswan High Dam project presented the perfect opportunity. The Aswan High Dam on the Nile River was designed to provide irrigation and electric power to Egypt. It had taken years to engineer, and at the end of 1955, President Nasser was ready to start construction, but he needed funding. The Soviets made an offer, but Dulles made a better one. Without input from Eisenhower, Dulles helped negotiate a finance deal between the U.S., Britain, the World Bank, and Egypt to the tune of $400 million, $3.8 billion today. By the time Ike returned to the White House in November 1955, the Aswan Dam deal was moving forward, and Ike was happy with the deal and with his Secretary of State for a time. At the final hour, the political optics of the Aswan deal caused Dulles to reconsider as members of both parties began to express their concerns. Fiscal conservatives didn't like Ike sending large checks to foreign countries. Southerners didn't like helping Egypt grow cotton, and pro-Israeli Americans balked at supporting Egypt at all, one of Israel's strongest enemies. Dulles soon realized that the Aswan Dam project was a political minefield, but he didn't take his newfound concerns to the president. Without involving Ike at all, Dulles began looking for the exit. Secretary Dulles wasn't alone in his distrust of Egyptian President Gamal Nasser. Anthony Eden, the British Prime Minister, felt the same way. On March 1, 1956, Prime Minister Eden accused President Nasser of trying to curb British influence in the region. In a speech, Eden made clear his feelings about the Egyptian president, saying, "The world is not big enough to hold both me and Nasser." A few weeks later, Nasser made another fateful decision that seemed to give credence to Dulles' distrust. Nasser formally recognized the sovereignty of the Communist People's Republic of China. Dulles saw this move as an open endorsement of communism, and it gave him the perfect excuse to exit the Aswan High Dam deal. But Ike was still committed to it. Ike thought Egypt deserved U.S. support. On June 6th, Ike gave a D-Day anniversary speech and further explained his position. "We were a young country once, and our whole policy for the first 150 years was we were neutral. We must not be parsimonious." Ike's firm stance in favor of Egypt might have been enough to keep the Aswan deal alive, were it not for his deteriorating health. Not long after his D-Day anniversary speech, the president had a major ilitis attack. It was not his first brush with this painful intestinal ailment, but he usually suffered in silence. This time, though, Ike required emergency surgery and spent 5 weeks in recovery. With the president incapacitated, Dulles was again free to push his agenda. In late June 1956, Dulles called World Bank President Eugene Black into his office. Black had worked out the details of the international finance package for the Aswan High Dam. Dulles wanted to back out, and he wanted Black's blessing. In their meeting, Dulles led off by asking Black his opinion of whether or not Egypt would be able to pay back the loan. When Black expressed confidence that they would, Dulles balked. He suggested that Nasser had overextended Egypt's financial position, taking on both the Aswan deal and the previous arms purchase from the Soviets. But Black sniffed out Dulles' agenda. He realized that Dulles' mind was already made up and that the meeting was nothing more than an attempt to recruit Black to his side. Black told him, "Mr. Dulles, as far as the World Bank is concerned, it would save us a lot of trouble and a lot of worry if the deal was called off. But I will now say, as an American citizen and not as the president of the World Bank, that if you call it off, I think all hell will break loose." Dulles did not heed Black's warning. On July 19th, Dulles publicly announced that the United States would not help fund the Aswan High Dam. This gave British Prime Minister Eden an excuse to do the same. The World Bank was forced to retract its funding, since it couldn't keep the project afloat on its own. A week later, Black's prediction came to pass. All hell did indeed break loose. In order to fund the Aswan Dam project, President Nasser nationalized and took full control of the Suez Canal, the waterway connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. Nasser intended to use canal tolls to make up for the financing Dulles had taken off the table, but Great Britain and France had helped fund the Suez Canal's creation, and both countries still contributed money and staff to its maintenance and operations. So Britain and France did not take kindly to Nasser's plan to profit from a canal they helped create. In response, the two countries threatened to invade Egypt and retake the Suez Canal by force. Days later, Ike returned to work, having fully recovered from his ilitis attack. He was immediately faced with the fallout from Dulles' unauthorized decision to back out of the Aswan deal. Dulles' actions threatened to upset the delicate balance of peace in the Middle East, and the Soviets intimated that they would have no qualms about swooping in and restoring order in Egypt using their own methods. So Ike took the reins. Ike told British and French leaders that he would not support or even condone an invasion of Egypt. In a 1950 accord, the U.S. had promised to stand with any invaded country in the Middle East, and Ike would stand by that promise and side with Egypt, even if that meant going against long-standing allies like Britain and France. In the face of Ike's firm stance, the two countries backed down. Ike's cool-headed leadership eased tensions, but only for the moment. Not everyone was happy with how Ike handled the situation. Certainly not John Foster Dulles, and not Ike's enemies in the Democratic Party. Ike's Democratic opponents took issue with his handling of what would be called the Suez Canal crisis, and on the campaign trail in 1956, they would try to hit Ike on foreign policy. On Monday, August 13th, the Democratic National Convention opened in Chicago. The Democratic frontrunner, former Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson, had fared well in Democratic primaries. Stevenson, who had competed against Ike in the 1952 presidential race, had consistently attacked Eisenhower's foreign policy decisions, especially in Egypt. These attacks had moved the former governor to the front of the pack, forcing other contenders to drop out of the race before the convention. So by August of 1956, Stevenson stood poised to secure the Democratic nomination for a second time. But he would need a strong running mate, someone to stand behind his anti-Cold War platform and help him take on the five-star general turned commander-in-chief. Out of a crowded field of potential VP candidates, one man with a famous last name stood out, a name that would become synonymous with three letters that represented a new era of American politics: JFK. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free, like Wild West Extravaganza, a journey back to the fascinating, tumultuous, and often violent world of the American Old West. From famous outlaws like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, to lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, to trailblazing pioneers and frontiersmen, Wild West Extravaganza tells the true stories of the real-life characters who shaped this iconic era. So saddle up and discover the true history of the American frontier, the good, the bad, and the ugly, ad-free at intohistory.com.
In 2022, crypto trading platform FTX was poised for world takeover. Its founder was one of the richest people on the planet, and he was only 30. But then, one article and a couple of tweets changed everything, and in a matter of days, billions were wiped out of existence. Hey, I'm Jeremy Schwartz, host of the new true crime history podcast, American Criminal. We take you inside the minds of some of our most notorious felons and outlaws, exploring the dark side to the American dream. In our latest season, a cryptocurrency mogul builds an empire while telling everyone he wants to give it all away, but he never quite gets to that part. And eventually, his obsession with wealth brings it all crashing down around him. Listen to American Criminal, Sam Bankman-Fried, wherever you get your podcasts. Or to get early ad-free access to the entire season first, plus hundreds of other ad-free history podcast episodes, subscribe at intohistory.com.
By the time of the 1956 Democratic Convention, Massachusetts Senator John F. Kennedy was a rising star inside his party, and going into the 1956 convention, Kennedy had his sights on the number 2 job. He hoped that his early and vocal support of Adlai Stevenson would make him a serious contender, but the competition was stiff. If Kennedy wanted the job, he would have to fight for it. Stevenson liked Kennedy as a potential VP, but many party leaders were pushing another senator, Estes Kefauver. Being a Southerner from Tennessee, Kefauver would bring geographical balance to the Stevenson ticket. But Kennedy supporters had done a good job of setting up JFK for success. Party leaders had created a documentary called The Pursuit of Happiness, a history of the Democratic Party to be played at the convention and broadcast nationwide. Kennedy's people made sure JFK was prominently featured in the film. The rest of the plan was simple, but tried and true: make a rousing speech at the convention and win the delegates to his side. But 1 week before JFK headed to Chicago, Kennedy's plans were thrown into upheaval. JFK got word that Stevenson would likely ask him to make Stevenson's nominating speech. JFK knew politics well enough to know that this was an optics problem. Nominating Stevenson certainly put Kennedy in the spotlight, but JFK also saw that it hurt his chances at winning the VP spot. Not since William Jennings Bryan in 1896 had a delegate given a nominating speech and then received a nomination himself. If JFK gave that speech, it spelled disaster for his chances at becoming Stevenson's running mate. In truth, Kennedy was already playing from behind. Many party leaders were suspicious of Kennedy's Catholicism. They feared his loyalty to the Vatican might trump his loyalty to America. Additionally, his father, Joe Kennedy Sr., had been a powerful politician who had made plenty of enemies during his time in Washington. Many of those enemies just didn't trust Joe Kennedy's kin. As Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn told Adlai Stevenson, "If we have to have a Catholic, I hope we don't have to take that little pissant Kennedy." So Kennedy appealed directly to Stevenson. On August 14th, JFK sat down for a face-to-face with the Democratic frontrunner. As expected, Stevenson asked Kennedy to make the nominating speech. JFK agreed, but not before he pushed Stevenson on the question of the vice presidency. When JFK asked Stevenson if making the speech precluded his consideration as VP, Stevenson's response was hardly definitive. No, not necessarily. So in order to figure out his next move, JFK did what he often chose to do in moments of crisis. He called his dad. It's August 1956. JFK nervously paces his room at the Palmer House Hotel in Chicago as his brother Bobby dials a number on the rotary phone.
Hello?
Hello, I'd like to be connected to Joseph Kennedy's room, please. The boys are silent as they wait for their father to come on the line. It's a tense moment. Joseph does not want his son on the Stevenson ticket, and in the Kennedy household, what Joe Kennedy wants, he's used to getting. But today, his son Jack, as his family calls him, is going to upset the apple cart by going against his father's wishes. As Joe picks up the phone, Bobby can hear his mother, Rose, chatting in the background.
Hello?
Dad, it's Bobby. How are you? How's the Riviera?
Oh, it's fine, just fine. Your mother and I are having a wonderful time. How's the convention over there in Chicago?
Bobby looks at Jack, who gives him an encouraging nod. He takes a deep breath and then gets right to the point. Well, that's why I'm calling, Dad. Jack's run into a bit of a problem, and we need your help. See, Jack's been asked to officially nominate Stevenson as the presidential candidate at the convention tonight.
Well, what's the problem with that, Bobby? I'd say this is good news. You'll send the right signal to the delegates that Jack is not a contender for the VP spot.
But Jack is a contender, and he and Bobby are determined to convince their dad to help him along. Yeah, Jack sees it differently, Dad. He thinks he's got a good chance of winning the VP slot this year. Some of Jack's friends have already got a Nominate Jack headquarters set up in the hotel.
What?
Bobby holds the phone away from his ear as Joe explodes with anger.
Jack's being an idiot. He's tying himself to a sinking ship with Stevenson. That man thinks he can beat a war hero, a NATO commander, by attacking him on foreign policy. It'll never work. This will ruin Jack's career and this family's good name.
But Bobby doesn't back down. Dad, Jack is going for the VP spot one way or the other, but he needs your help, please. Hearing the softness in Bobby's voice, Joseph's anger momentarily subsides.
His mind's made up?
Yes, sir.
He's stubborn. Always has been.
Well, the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, Dad.
What does he need?
Get on the phone, Dad. Press Jack's case with as many big hitters at the convention as you can reach. Tell them to support Jack over that fool Kefauver. Can you do that, Dad?
I'll make some calls.
Thanks, Dad.
Don't thank me yet.
In 1956, political mastermind Joe Kennedy Sr. saw what many Democrats couldn't. Attacking Ike on foreign policy was a losing strategy. The president's approval ratings were sky high due to his calm leadership through international problems, like the crisis in Egypt. Despite this, Stevenson and Democratic leaders chose to focus their attacks on Ike's Cold War leadership. Joseph Kennedy knew that would not be a winning strategy. He wanted his son JFK to steer clear of the mess the Democrats were driving straight into. At the convention, as expected, Stevenson won the nomination on the first ballot. But late that night, he did something unexpected. After officially accepting his party's nomination, Stevenson opted not to handpick a vice president. He told the delegates, "I've decided that the selection of the vice presidential nominee should be made through the free process of the convention, so that the Democratic Party's candidate for this office may join me before the nation, not as one man's selection, but as one chosen by our great party." After Stevenson's announcement, he said to a colleague, "I've either done the smartest thing in my life, or I've done the dumbest thing." Senator Lyndon B. Johnson took the latter position. He called Stevenson's decision the goddamnedest, stupidest move a politician could make. Brilliant or brainless, Stevenson's announcement threw the convention into chaos, and it started a ticking clock. The vote was set to take place Thursday afternoon. Immediately, Kennedy's team scrambled into action, desperate to line up as many delegate votes as possible. But the backroom bargains, closed-door deals, and political horse trading wasn't enough. Neither was Joe Kennedy Sr.'s many phone calls on his son's behalf. In the end, Estes Kefauver won the VP nomination on the third ballot, 755 to 589. JFK graciously conceded.
I want to take this opportunity first to express my appreciation to Democrats from all parts of the country, north and south, east and west, who have been so generous and kind to me this afternoon. I think that it proves, as nothing else could prove, what a strong and united party the Democratic Party is.
It might reasonably be asserted that his concession speech at the 1956 Democratic Convention was the beginning of JFK's 1960 presidential campaign. By losing the VP nomination, JFK had set himself up for winning. Not only did his gracious speech make him look good on the national stage, but JFK would be able to keep his hands clean of the mistakes and miscalculations of the Stevenson campaign, just like his father Joe had wanted. After the VP nomination, Stevenson addressed the convention. He laid out his plan of attack to challenge Ike on foreign policy.
The truth is not that our policy has the communists on the run. The truth is not that we are winning the Cold War. The truth is that we are losing the Cold War.
As the Republican convention approached, Ike reluctantly accepted the idea of a second term in the White House. He had publicly stated that he would be a one-term president. He'd even told his brother Milton that he didn't want 4 more years, and that if he ever changed his mind, Milton should call in the psychiatrist, or even better, the sheriff. But in the end, Ike did change his mind. Foreign tensions were too high to let someone else step into the Oval Office. Believing only he could navigate the Cold War and the crisis in Egypt, Ike told party leaders that he would accept their nomination. On August 20th, the Republican National Convention opened in San Francisco. Ike and his VP Nixon were renominated by acclamation. But in his acceptance speech, Ike sidestepped pressing issues like Egypt and the Cold War, perhaps because he hoped to avoid topics that would bring attention to the public rift between himself and Secretary of State Dulles. He also didn't address Stevenson's claim that Americans were losing the Cold War. He instead focused on party unity. Ike's military-style leadership had not translated to Republican harmony. His friendly overtures to the Soviets and acceptance of Egypt's neutralism angered not only Dulles, but many conservative Republicans. Ike's moderate stance sounded a little too democratic for the rightmost wing of the GOP. And by the time of the convention, though the American public largely sided with Ike, they didn't necessarily side with the Republican Party. Ike's approval ratings remained high. The Republican Party's ratings were far less favorable. So at the convention, Ike tried to convince voters that both he and the Republican Party could lead them forward.
Today I want to demonstrate the truth of a single proposition. The Republican Party is the party of the future. I hold that the Republican Party and platform are right in 1956 because they are most closely in league with the future. And for this reason, the Republican Party and program are and will be decisively approved by the American people in 1956.
But Ike would not be able to talk about party unity after the convention. Democrats and Cold War flare-ups ensured that his 1956 re-election campaign would focus almost entirely on foreign affairs. From the left, Stevenson launched a campaign against Ike's foreign policy. From the right, Dulles continued to think that Ike needed to take a stronger stand against communism. During the campaign season, Ike would need to answer Stevenson's barbs, keep Dulles in line, and try to throw water on the flames of tension still ablaze in Egypt. If you're a careful Wicked Game listener, you know in the credits I mentioned my friend Professor Greg Jackson and his podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. It's a great show. But one way it doesn't suck even more is when you listen to it without ads. You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game, all episodes of History That Doesn't Suck, and all episodes of many more great history podcasts without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. History That Doesn't Suck is a deeply researched chronological survey of American history from a trained academic who also knows how to tell a story. Plus, in addition to ad-free listening to one of the best American history podcasts out there, you get scores of bonus episodes at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. Icebergs, jagged rocks and rocky straits, mutinies, misfortune, and broadside battles. There are more tales of the sea than survivors to tell them, but the podcast Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is doing a good job, and you can listen to all episodes of that podcast plus many others, including American Elections Wicked Game, without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is one of my favorites from last year, a podcast about the greatest mishaps, misfortune, and misadventures of the sea. You'll hear stories of corruption, greed, bad intentions, and just plain horrible decision-making that resulted in some of the worst maritime disasters from all over the world. And some of these are more recent than you think. All episodes are ad-free, including bonus content and more at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. In September 1956, Britain and France asked for U.S. support to retake the Suez Canal from Egypt. Stevenson publicly called for Ike to side with America's traditional allies. Ike didn't listen. He made it clear he would preserve peace in Egypt no matter the political cost. In a show of faith Dulles' past actions had not merited, Ike asked Dulles to help tamp down the situation with Britain and France, catching Dulles in a by now familiar tug-of-war between Ike's orders and Dulles' personal agenda. Dulles wanted to support Britain's efforts to retake the Suez Canal, but as Secretary of State, he had a responsibility to present and defend the president's position to leave Egypt alone. So Dulles tried to do both. The consequences were disastrous. Publicly, Dulles parroted Ike's position and stated the U.S. would not shoot their way to the canal. But in private talks with British Prime Minister Anthony Eden, Dulles defied Ike's instructions and implied that the U.S. would back Britain if it took military action against Egypt. Embarrassed and frustrated by Dulles' doublespeak, Eden cut off nearly all communications with the U.S. and turned to allies he felt he could trust, France and Israel. Thereafter, Britain, France, and Israel kept Dulles in the dark as they plotted to invade Egypt. On October 27, 1956, just days before the election, CIA operatives noticed Israel massing troops on its border with Egypt. When Ike heard this, he realized Dulles had failed him again. Dulles had not put out the fire in Egypt. His confusing actions had fanned the flames. Ike would no longer allow Dulles to act alone. If America's allies hoped Ike would be too preoccupied with the election to notice, or too worried about losing the election to take action, they were wrong. Ike quickly sent a blunt message to Israel. The U.S. would do whatever it took to keep peace in Egypt. In his message, Ike made it clear that the upcoming election would have no bearing on his decision to take action against Israeli aggression. Israel did not respond. On October 29th, the main Israeli force marched across their southwest border into Egypt. Israeli paratroopers dropped from French airplanes only 20 miles east of the Suez Canal. Egyptian forces began mobilizing to block the Israeli advance. War looked imminent. At 6 p.m., Eisenhower heard about the Israeli invasion while giving a campaign speech in Richmond, Virginia. He immediately got on a plane back to Washington. As soon as Ike deplaned, he met with Dulles and started barking orders. Ike commanded Dulles to send a message to the Israelis. You tell them, goddammit, that we're going to apply sanctions. We're going to the United Nations. We're going to do everything that there is so we can stop this thing. This time, Dulles did as he was told. And while Dulles fired off Ike's ultimatum, the president called his closest advisors into an emergency meeting. It's 7:15 p.m. on October 29th in the Oval Office. Ike sits with 9 other men, including Secretary of State Dulles and Joint Chief of Staff Admiral Arthur Radford, trying to figure out his next move. Radford briefs the others in the room on the current situation in Egypt. The Israeli operation has gone too far for them to pull back now. They may attack Egyptian airfields tonight. The president is in a foul mood, still irritated with his Secretary of State. But Ike does his best to control his emotions and focus on the task at hand. What will be the Egyptian response? They probably can't attack Israel in night operations, Mr. President. Their airplanes lack that capability. So the Israelis are more likely counting on the operation not running more than 3 days. Dulles disagrees with this assessment. Even though he's in hot water, he still speaks up. Mr. President, I think the operation goes further than that. The Israelis will likely disrupt the Suez Canal. In that case, British and French intervention must be foreseen. Radford doesn't disagree, so he offers Ike some information that supports Dulles' view. Sir, you ought to know that Israel has obtained 30 to 50 French planes that we had no notice of. This supply of aircraft is in violation of our agreement whereby we were supposed to be notified. Mr. President, the French and British appear to be ready to intervene on Israel's behalf. In fact, they may have concerted their actions with the Israelis. Ike sees the writing on the wall. The British, French, and Israelis have planned this invasion together. But in the face of this defiance, Ike refuses to back down. Gentlemen, I recall that the 1950 Tripartite Declaration pledges us to support any victim of aggression in the Middle East. In these circumstances, perhaps we cannot be bound by our traditional alliances. Should we make a public statement letting the information out that we're considering what steps we might take to support Egypt and redeem our pledge? Dulles looks unsure. Sir, the French and British may think... But Dulles stops himself short. He's already on thin ice. What he's about to say might anger the president, but Dulles feels it needs to be said. Sir, what I mean is, whatever we think of what they have done, we have to go along with our traditional allies. Ike's anger boils over. He spews rage in Dulles' direction. What would they think if we were to go into Egypt to fulfill our pledge? Nothing justifies double-crossing us. Sir, you may want to consider how action against Israel will be perceived by voters. I don't care whether I'm reelected or not. We must make good on our word. Otherwise, we are a nation without honor. I don't really think the American people would throw me out in the midst of a situation like this, but if they do, so be it. On October 30th, the U.S. went to the UN and introduced a bill calling for a ceasefire and full withdrawal of Israeli forces from Egypt. In an unprecedented move, Britain and France vetoed the bill. The situation in Egypt deteriorated rapidly as fighting continued. Britain and France issued ceasefire ultimatums to Egypt. In response, Egyptian President Nasser blocked the Suez Canal. 12 hours later, British bombers began flying over Cairo. And with the American election just days away, Ike had to find a way to end the Suez Canal crisis or risk handing the White House to Democratic candidate Adlai Stevenson. Stevenson criticized Ike's handling of the Suez Canal crisis. He argued that the U.S. should back its allies. Ike knew that he needed to answer these attacks, but he did not trust Dulles to deliver the message. He'd learned his lesson. So instead, Ike took his case directly to the American people himself. Early on October 31st, Ike purchased a short TV slot for that evening. At 7 p.m., Ike got behind the cameras. He calmly explained the turbulent events that had led to the Suez Canal crisis. He then said,
"The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions, nor were we informed of them in advance. As it is the manifest right of any of these nations to take such decisions and actions, it is likewise our right, if our judgment so dictates, to dissent. We believe these actions to have been taken in error, for we do not accept the use of force as a wise or proper instrument for the settlement of international disputes."
With this speech, Ike reclaimed full control of the message. Peace in Egypt and a smooth path to re-election seemed within his grasp. But two more hurdles stood in his way. On November 4th, 200,000 Soviet troops put down a popular uprising in Budapest, Hungary. The troops brutally killed 20,000 Hungarians, including the uprising's leader, Nagy Imre, and installed a puppet leader that would follow the party line. Ike sympathized with the Hungarians. He publicly condemned the Soviets for preventing the Hungarians from choosing their own government. But Ike did not intervene. He had his hands full in Egypt. On November 5th, Britain and France defied a UN ceasefire agreement. The two countries landed on Egypt's beaches near Port Said in an amphibious landing reminiscent of D-Day. Ike was furious. He stood a hair's breadth away from ordering a military strike against Britain. But before he did that, Ike tried one last tack. Eisenhower called British Prime Minister Eden on the phone hours after the beach landing. The former general used all his weight to threaten Eden into submission. He told Eden that he would flush the already drowning British pound if British troops didn't agree to an immediate and unequivocal ceasefire. This financial threat got Eden's attention. The next day, Great Britain began withdrawing troops from Egypt. The French military had no choice but to follow suit. So despite Dulles' rogue actions, Eisenhower had staved off war in Egypt and preserved peace in the Middle East. On Tuesday, November 6th, Americans thanked him at the polls. Ike won the election in a landslide even bigger than 1952, with 57% of the popular vote and 41 states. Ike's military experience had served him well as president in his first term. His military-like leadership during the Suez Canal crisis earned him another 4 years in the White House. Despite Dulles' and Stevens' attempts to pull him in opposite directions, Ike had stayed on the political middle road. But Ike had failed on one front. He had not reestablished Republican Party unity. His personal popularity did not restore voters' faith in the GOP, and this would be a serious problem for Republicans in the 1960 presidential election. In the 1956 contest, Joe Kennedy Sr. had wisely seen that Adlai Stevenson's candidacy was doomed, and he had done what he could to keep his son off a losing ticket. In the 1960 presidential election, the divisions in the Republican Party would give JFK an opportunity to win the White House and live up to his family name. This is episode 43 of American Elections Wicked Game, 1956, A Chance for Peace. On the next episode, the election of 1960, Democrat John F. Kennedy and Republican Richard Nixon fight for the White House on new technological turf. The rise of television sets the stage for an unprecedented campaign defined by race, religion, and dirty tricks. Tired of ads and promos like these? Want to skip ahead to newer elections? You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. But not only that, you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free. That includes the American Revolution podcast, a deep and thorough investigation of the times, people, and politics behind America's fight for independence. Also, the battles, because we can't start a new American nation without guns. And the American Revolution podcast tells the story of the revolution from beginning to end, from its origins in the French and Indian War, through the war itself, and on to the founding of the United States. Get American Elections Wicked Game, the American Revolutions podcast, and many others ad-free with bonus content at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. This episode contains reenactments and dramatized details, and while in most cases we can't know exactly what was said, all our dramatizations are based on historical research. American Elections Wicked Game is an Airship production, hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham. Audio editing by Molly Bach. Sound design by Derek Behrens. Music by Lindsey Graham. Co-executive produced by Stephen Walters in association with Ritual Productions. Written and researched by C.L. Salazar. Fact-checking by Greg Jackson from the podcast History That Doesn't Suck.